Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And although we are continuing our war crimes series this week, we've also got an occasional series of other shows that don't fit into that topic. And this is the first of an ongoing series about the portrayal and image of a nation's soldiers, both from within and outside the country. Dr. Peter Williams has taught military history in music. He's worked in museums. He's written books about the Aussie soldier. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoons or good evening where you are, sir. How are you today?
G'day, Woody. I'm good. I'm fine. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. So I'll just start with my limey British POM version of Australian soldier. When I grew up reading the comics and watching the war films, the Australian soldier was always sort of bigger, taller, braver. They ran into battle fearlessly, and it was the British soldiers who had to kind of, for example, learn jungle fighting, that kind of thing. And it was Australians always called Bluey and Digger and had kind of led the way. And that was very much what I grew up with from my point of view of the Australian soldier. Is that similar to how the Aussie is seen from from Australia itself, or is it slightly more nuanced there?
More nuanced from my own perspective, but yeah, sure, that's how Australians would love to see the Australian soldier. I was looking up the heights and weights of average of Australian soldiers, sort of what the average digger was, and in the First World War he was taller than the average British soldier, and then the Americans came along in 1980 and they were taller again, but right. He was. But then the stats, if the start of World War II, show there's no difference. There's no difference in height or weight or physical appearance between Australian and British soldiers then. But yes, about the bravery leading from the front. Yes, that's the way he's seen here. That's the way the digger's seen.
Mm. And these are a couple of comic covers I found when I put this PowerPoint together, and that's exactly how I grew up. That they were the that chopping a rifle with a machete there kind of image there. And what we're going to do today, folks, is kind of discuss where that comes from and is it true, and is there a difference, and how do other countries see it? So, Peter, take us through the different types of Australian soldier, both in the First World War and the Second World War, because there's regulars, there's territorials or reservists, or the chocos, as is the World War II label, and then you have conscripts. I mean, is the Australian experience broadly the same as the other countries?
I expect so. You've got well, in the First World War, you've got the permanent military force, the citizen military force, and the Australian Imperial Force. And in the Second World War, you've got the same thing. This permanent military force is just a force of about 2,800 men in 1939, and it's there to operate the coastal guns guarding the ports, but also to expand the army when the time comes, when it's needed. So that's a very small force. Then you've got the militia, the citizen military force, which you had in both wars, but according to legislation in 1903, it can't fight outside of Australia or Australia's territories, and so that becomes important in the Second World War. Yeah. Because there's the territory of Papua and the territory of New Guinea, and they are sent. They can fight there, but then they can't be sent further afield. And the third is the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force. It's just raised when there's a big war. In 1914 it was raised. In 1939 it was raised again.
Thank you. And talk, though we are going to be mostly focusing World War II, the First World War experience, I think, shapes a lot of this. And I'm members of the Gallipoli Facebook pages, and it's full of the cliches of British commanders letting down the Aussies and all that kind of thing. We're not going to go into the examination of a Gallipoli as a battle, but there is a slight difference in the sense that the Brits sort of had to hop on a boat and they're across the channel, and there they are in the Western Front in terms of that theatre, whereas the Australians, wherever they're going, it's a long old journey there and it's a long old journey back.
And the great majority don't go home in the whole war. So the great majority are away for 3 or 4 years. They stay until it's over.
So, I was going to say, with the fact, as you said, very good point there, the Australians didn't go home. How was the Australian media in the First World War portraying the Australian soldier? Because they are a long way from home. There would have been some people questioning, what is this war even about? It's other side of the world. did that begin to shape some of the myth, the image of the Australian soldier?
Yes, yeah, we've got media covering the war. There's a lot of war reporting. This other side of the world business, I don't think this is a problem for the Australian soldier. He sees he's fighting for the empire.
Right.
The Germans have part of their empire in the Western Pacific, and Australians see that it's necessary to go to other places, attack the Turks at Gallipoli, because this is all about maintaining the power and prestige of the empire. And they were real empire men in 1914 to 1918.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just moving through a couple of photos of the First World War soldier, and you know, the slouch hat, and certain variances in uniform and equipment. You can start, even if you don't know uniforms, if you're scrolling through First World War photos, often the Australian or the New Zealand soldiers do stand out quite well. So is this really the beginning of a sort of a separate identity for the Aussie soldier, being, you know, with the slouch hat? Is there a sense of them being a bit scruffier or more independent, or what do you think the image is that is starting to come out the First World War?
Independent-minded and lacking respect for authority.
Right.
They're the sons and grandsons of convicts, and they don't have. I think that's where it comes from. They don't have. They don't like authority. They get that from their parents and their grandparents. But no, I think there's something of this developing in the Boer War, the Second Boer War. In fact, that's where the diggers, the term may come from. There were about 20,000 Australians working in the gold mines and the diamond mines in South Africa when the war broke out. And they say possibly up to half of them joined various imperial units. Thornycroft's mounted infantry, who fought at Spion Kop, they were half Australian when they were formed. I don't know what the proportion of Australians was later in the war. But so there were a lot of Australians there, and they called themselves diggers. Some people say the idea of the term that the Australian soldier is a digger comes from the Boer War. There are a lot of theories about it. So possibly before the First World War, but definitely, yes, in the First World War, that's when everyone knows this term.
Okay, and we will definitely drill down on this idea of a lack of respect for authority, because that's something, going back to my comic reading, they were very brave, they were very tall, they were very fierce, but they were the kind of ones who did their own thing. And even in the comics, which are often written by World War II veterans back in the day, there was this sense of, you don't follow what the officer's saying, and we don't do what the generals say. And you know, we can't avoid talking about the Australian soldier without dipping into Gallipoli to some extent. And the Gallipoli, I'm not going to say myth, because obviously it was a real battle, but Gallipoli is something that stirs people in many different ways in terms of the representation of the Australian and indeed their relationship with the British or the Empire more broadly. So how would you define that relationship between Australia and its partners coming out of the First World War, and how much does Gallipoli affect that?
I'm not sure of your question. Go on a bit.
I mean,
I'm quite with you.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, you're just going to go on Facebook groups and social media. When Gallipoli comes up, Australians tend to say it's all the British fault. We were let down there, blah blah blah. You know, that kind of reaction to the relationship between the Australians and their British partners being at some point not entirely positive, shall we say?
Sure. Yeah. Well, many Australians still think that. I'm not sure. I think it might have even grown. I'm not so convinced that the diggers at Gallipoli had such a feeling about this as people who watch the movie Gallipoli these days walk out of the movie theatre and they think, well, that's how it happened. Those Pommy officers, they stuffed it all up. They got our lads killed. You know, I'm not so sure it was such a big thing back there. But I wanted to make another point about this ill discipline. This force that was sent to Gallipoli had only been raised about 6 months before and only had about 4 or 5 months training. You wouldn't expect it to be anything other than ill-disciplined, I think. Compare it to the AIF, the AIF that goes away in 1939, 1940. It doesn't get into action until January 1941. and it's had over a year of training. Also, those officers at Gallipoli, Moorshead and Blamey and Vasey and people like that, they saw the ill discipline in the AIF in the First World War, and they didn't want that again. So I think there was less of that ill discipline, less of that lack of respect for authority in the Second World War, because the officers who'd experienced it in the First World War were now senior ranks, were generals, and they weren't going to have a repeat of what they saw in the First World War.
Well, good point. And let's talk about relationship with commanding officers, because we've never done a deep dive on the channel about General Thomas Blamey, but he's come up numerous times in numerous shows with both Australian and American historians. And you know, we when we debate whether Montgomery was loved by his men or not loved by his men, it seems that broadly speaking, he was loved by his men, if not maybe always getting on well with his fellow commanders. What sort of relationship the Australians have with their commanders, and how does Blamey fit the stereotype?
Well, I'll start briefly at the top. Above Blamey is MacArthur.
Yeah.
Now, MacArthur is not popular in Australia. In fact, all the Australian fans of MacArthur are sitting in this chair right now. Yeah, not many people have a good word to say about him. And it's interesting because there's some, one of the things they were bitter about was that MacArthur packed his senior staff with Americans. The top 10 positions in MacArthur's headquarters in Melbourne were Americans, and Australian soldiers were 90% of his land forces in 42 and 43. So they were bitter that Americans were making life and death decisions about Australian soldiers. That was one of the reasons MacArthur was not like. The other thing is he's a ratbag and terribly unpleasant man. But to me, that seems to be missing the point. You just want generals to win battles. That's all that matters. They don't have to be nice people. I believe Napoleon, Frederick the Great, Genghis Khan, I believe they weren't nice fellas, so I'm told, and nobody cares about that. And it doesn't matter as long as they win battles, they're okay. Blamey also I quite like, but the incident that's interesting and why Blamey is not popular with some is the so-called rabbit speech. He gave a speech in New Guinea in 1942 to some troops who'd been beaten on the Kokoda track, and they took one version of what he said and thought he was criticizing them. They were molten with rage, according to somebody. I'll just actually read a little bit of what some people said he said, because you see, this speech that got him into all this trouble, there's no written version of it. It's just that people wrote down what they thought he said. And where we are. Hang on a sec. Here somewhere. Yeah, so the troops got very upset with it, and it was a black mark against Blamey right through the rest of the war. Here it is. Now, one version of what Blamey said in the speech is supposedly to inspire the troops, you'd think. It's the rabbit who runs who gets shot, not the man holding the gun. The soldiers understood this to mean they ran like rabbits. It's a very angry reaction and a lasting scar on Blamey's reputation. And people are still talking about it even now. The veterans are still talking about it 40 years on when I was interviewing them. Blamey said we ran like rabbits is their version. But then you read what other people write who were there. Brigadier Doherty was there, and he said, it never entered my head the general was being offensive or intended to be. Doherty wrote that Blamey said, the Jap was like a gorilla. He would get into his hole and would not surrender. To be dealt with, he had to be got out of his hole like shooting rabbits. In their burrows, they can't be shot. But get them on the run, and the man with a gun can kill them. And now that sounds okay. You don't know why the soldiers would take offence at that. My own idea is that they had actually been beaten, and they didn't like it being pointed out to them. This was 21st Brigade, and they'd lost 3 battles straight with the Japanese. They had been pushed back, and they kind of were very sensitive on that point, and though Blamey didn't possibly, he didn't mean to insult them, they took it that way. anyway, that's one of the bit of things. It's such an interesting case that what Blamey actually said, what's true here, that I used it in a high school textbook I wrote about the war in New Guinea, where you give this, it's an exercise for students. You give them the evidence of all the people who wrote down what they said Blamey said, and you try and work out what he might have said. And there are just so many conflicting interpretations, and we don't know.
Well, that's one of those things we've talked about, that with, for example, even orders given by people like Eisenhower in 1944, you can interpret them in 3 different ways because they're not very precise. There's lots of sort of push on if okay. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean how do you define okay? But Ernest Malley made a good comment there. To be fair, Doherty would take Blamey's side. He got the 21st Brigade out of him. So
yeah, all right, good point. Yeah, okay, but it's an interesting. I don't know what Blamey said. It's an interesting topic, but you can read a lot of different fellows who were there who wrote down what they thought he said, and they contradict each other, and it's just an interesting case what he said.
But your point about, you've been on the channel talking about Kokoda and those early battles in New Guinea, which didn't go the Australian way, and as the first American battles didn't always go the Americans' way. How you deal with success as a soldier is one way of looking at a soldier, but how you deal with things not going your way is another representation, isn't it? Assuming even the poorest soldier, if they win a battle, they can come off feeling proud, but how you deal with that adversity. And the reality is that the Empire, in their first couple of years of the war, are dealing with more defeats than they are dealing with victories. How does the Australian soldier, is the tendency to put the blame upwards and say, well, it's just leadership again, this idea of a lack of respect for authority, rather than maybe taking it inwards and saying maybe we didn't perform as well?
I think the tendency is to blame the higher ups. The tendency is not to admit that we stuffed up. We weren't very good, or we weren't as good as the enemy, and they knew more about this business than we did, and they defeated us. I don't hear a lot of the veterans admitting that. I should probably add about, I keep mentioning in the interviews with veterans, but the reason I've got something to say about this is because I interviewed a couple of hundred veterans and recorded interviews with them, and one day I'll get a book out on that. But I started out just talking to veterans on the bus on the way home from school. I would see the return services badge on the fellow's lapel, and I'd go and talk to them, and sometimes I'd even get off the bus stop where they got off and follow them to their house. And I remember one fellow giving me a cup of tea and biscuits and then shoving me out the door. I guess he'd had enough. But I've always wanted to. I even interviewed a couple of Boer War veterans. Talked to a couple of Boer War veterans when I was only born about 11 and a half years after the war. So these fellows weren't. They were about 30 years older than me, and a lot of my teachers were World War II veterans. My boss at Anglesey Barracks in Tasmania, he got an MM at Tarakan, and I was terrified of him. And then 30 years later, I went back to interview him, and he was a lovely old man. I wasn't frightened of him anymore. And they all did that. They were all World War II veterans. The diggers were scary to me. They were tough guys when I was little. But then I go and talk to them, and I think, what lovely old men. That's all.
Well, that's interesting
about connecting, how I connect with the veterans.
Well, that's an interesting thing to drill down on, because if you're feeling as a young person that they're tough, maybe even unapproachable, that you don't go up and speak. I mean, living in France as I do, there's this idea that if you see a French Foreign Legion veteran walking down the street, you cross the street to avoid walking past him, because although the French want them there to save them in wars, there's this sense, don't go and talk to them, because they're angry, they're maybe even violent. So do you think the Australian coming back from the Second World War, for example, felt the need to kind of be part of this stoic, strong digger mentality?
I think the war had just brutalized many of them. It just had. It was really horrible, and it did something to them. I think. It's hard to say. And I mean, it sort of depends. I mean, we're talking too generally here. There's such a variety in fellows that I interviewed, and a variety in their experience. And one thing that struck me the other day, I spoke to a fellow called Lindsay Mason once, because I wanted to speak to him about a particular battle that he was in, and I discovered that was his only battle. He was in it for 4 days. He was lightly wounded. He went to the rear. His mate said, "Would you like a job in motor transport?" And he thought, "Oh, gee, wouldn't mind a rest from the war. Yeah, I'll take that." And he ended up staying in motor transport for the rest of the war. So his experience, he was in the AIF for 5 years, but he had 4 days in battle. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got the fellows who went right through. There was a fellow called Slab. I can't remember his real name. They all had nicknames. It was Sappy first. He introduced me, and I decided to try and catch up with all the living members of one infantry platoon that I could. So Sappy passed me on to Zero, and they called him Zero because when he went out with the lads, he never scored. And anyway, they told me, they all said, Zero and Sappy and Johnny, and you know, they all said, "Oh, we hated the war, but wait till you talk to Slab. Slab loved the war. Wait till you talk to him." This is what they all said. So I was more inclined to believe them after having heard repeated statements that Slab was just different. And when I met him, he was indeed different. Slab said he loved the war. He had a great time. He discovered he had this great talent for hunting down and killing people, and that this was where it was admired. And from being a truck driver in a small country town, he became the most loved man in his platoon, famous in the company, even a well-known battalion identity, because he wasn't frightened. He said, "It didn't frighten me. I loved doing it. I was good at something. I was the best at this job of anybody I knew, and everybody else knew that. And suddenly, I'm admired." He just said it was the peak of his life, and then he went back to being a truck driver. And he said that was the peak, and now I'm back down here again. So yeah, I sort of, when we talk about the typical digger, I sort of think, here's a guy who had, when I mentioned Mason and Slab, and there's different, and there's everything in between. There's such a turnover too in focusing on infantry battalions now. Now Mason's battalion was the 2nd 14th. At sort of on a jungle scale, it was only about 800 strong for most of the war. Yet about 3,500 men served in it. If you take out killed and seriously wounded, you still get the battalion turning over about 4 times. So there must have been a lot of Lindsay Mason stories. People go in, they experience some war, and then by the time the next campaign comes around, they've got a job in administration, or they're back training, or somehow they're not with the battalion anymore. So a lot of people, some people didn't have much experience of war, and some people had a lot.
Yeah, I mean, David Watson just said there is no typical digger, and I think that's probably going to be the thing. There's going to be no typical Tommy, or there's no typical Canuck, but there is definitely, and this is kind of the point of this conversation, an image of what the typical digger is. And again, as the POM here, I'm thinking that your average Australian soldier in both wars comes from the middle of the bush. They're a horseman, or they work, in that kind of environment. I don't think of them as coming, as like Alan Allport writes about the Brits, from shops, from shopkeepers, from middle England. I don't think of the digger in that regard.
Yeah, well, I've got me to read to you from the typical digger that might sort of connect with what you're saying there. This is Bob Iscoff from up from Glenrowan, Ned Kelly country, up in the north of Victoria. I grew up in Glenrowan on a farm as one of a family of 7. Went through the Depression. He was born in 1920. Days when things were pretty tough. As a young fellow, I trapped rabbits. We sold for 4p a pair. We lived passably well because we had fowls and we milked our cows by hand. We had fruit and vegetables. I killed a sheep regularly, and occasionally a steer was killed and shared between the neighbours. So I know a little about rough conditions. We had to work hard, and we were living on fairly unproductive land. Needed a bit of scrub clearing. There was always fencing to do. The rabbits had to be kept under control. We had all kinds of fun as kids. We kicked the football around the yard, played cricket. went hunting and camping in the bush. Social life in those days was pretty basic. There were no radios. On Saturday night, we played 500 on euchre. The gramophone, we had the gramophone with the old 78 records. Sometimes we'd have friends around for a bit of a dance. And then when the war began, he had to go in. He was actually in the CMF at that time. And he said the next summer, the summer after the war began, we were released for a few weeks. We were all farm boys, and we had to get the harvest in. Now, all that creates an image of a typical bush digger, and Bob was that. And I think that because I think that people from the country make better soldiers than people from the city. Machiavelli thinks this too. In The Art of War in 1521, he said that rural men make better soldiers because urban life is full of comfort, luxury, moral decay, and a weakening of the martial spirit. And because Australia is less urbanised, and because people from the countryside tended to volunteer more than the people from the city, you find around about 50% of the AIF, well, and the CMF, you find about 50% of your diggers are country boys, a high proportion. Australia is not as urbanised as England. Yeah. England, for example, it's 80% urbanised in 1939.
Yeah.
So if there's any argument that country boys make better soldiers, then there's more of them in a less urbanised country like Australia was then. It certainly isn't like that now.
I mean, that's something that comes up a lot when we're talking about, for example, the American National Guard divisions. If they seem to come from rural Appalachia or the mountains, they seem to be regarded as better soldiers than the guys drafted in the cities or Chicago or New York. But I'd love to see some actual data on whether or not that is. I mean, obviously, there's some truth to it because they're, as you said there, they may be better skilled at moving about in the countryside. They've got maybe they're better shot with a rifle.
They've got bushcraft, they've got independence, they've got toughness. These things are good things when you're in the army and then you have to live outside for a long time.
Yeah.
If you take care of yourself outside, then you're halfway there.
Yeah, no, definitely. So let's move into Australia's relationship with its allies, and particularly from a World War II point of view. And we've talked a lot recently about New Guinea, Boona, Australians and Americans alongside each other there at various stages of the campaign when it was going worse and going better. Mark, my guest on Friday, talking about the American 32nd Division, said the relationships between Australians and Americans were broadly very, very good in New Guinea. You would push back on that a bit, wouldn't you?
I would push back on that a bit. There's a few strands here. The Australians controlled the delivery of supplies, and the Americans complained that slightly more than half the supplies were going to the Australians. And I looked at the numbers, and that's true. So the Americans were not too happy about that. However, at the upper echelon, with General Herring and Michael Berger and Harding before him, and George Vasey, commander of 7th Division, I thought they got on reasonably well. Now, Herring said that his job was not really to direct the battle, but to make sure the Australians and Americans worked together. That was it. It's a bit of an Eisenhower sort of angle on the whole thing, the directing campaign in Europe, that the most important thing here is these two, the Brits and the Americans, can work together. And Herring thought that was his job, to make that happen. I think it did happen at the higher levels. Down below, the Australians were upset because they didn't feel the Americans, this 32nd Division, pulled its weight. The battlefield was divided into, let's say, the northern half and the southern half. The Australians had the northern half, the Americans the southern half. There were twice as many Americans in the southern half as Australians in the northern half at the start, yet there were a lot more Japanese to deal with in the northern part. So the Australians thought the Americans are not pulling their weight because they're being held up by a much smaller force, and we're doing the hard yards in the north. That's true as far as it goes, but then the Americans had the tougher task. The southern half of the Boona position was better defended by the Japanese. There was more bunkers. There were even some concrete and steel bunkers down there. And the fresh troops the Japanese brought in just before the battle began, they were all sent to the south. So you've got that problem too. So that, you know, it's hard to say.
I mean, Ernest Malley added the comment.
The Australians were not very kind about the American performance here, and but I don't think it doesn't all start. There's a long thread in Australia of anti-Americanism. In fact, some people trace it back to the gold rush in the 1850s. Well, there was California gold rush of the 1840s, and after that's fading away, and there's the gold rushes in Australia, in New South Wales and Victoria. Up to 40,000 Americans came over, and when you look at the newspapers at the time, you can see the great prejudice against them. The journalists are just bashing the Americans and accusing them all of crimes there. I sort of wonder if there hasn't been a long strain of some kind of anti-American feeling, so that it doesn't come from the Second World War. It might have. It might go further back. I'm not sure of that.
And I thought it was us Poms you didn't like, but Ernest Manley made the point. Eichelberger and Herring were great friends. Their families spent a few Christmases together after the war. So, you know,
okay, that is interesting. I didn't know that.
Okay, I mean, it's these things are the levels of connection are multiple, because, as you said, there are generals on how they get on, and it down to soldiers actually fighting alongside each other. As we were talking before going live, there aren't actually many cases, except in movies, where you get a platoon of Americans alongside a platoon of Australians or British or Australians. That's sort of a movie trope. You know, armies fight in there under their commands as corps, things like that. So is part of what they're thinking about each other just based on kind of, realigned gossip to some extent?
Oh, sure. Joe, the guy across the road that I used to go and talk to at about 6 or 7 years old, he told me that he'd heard that the 8th Air Force in Europe, that they wouldn't go and bomb German targets unless an RAF plane flew with them to watch them. Otherwise, they just wouldn't do it. He was just that was that kind of thing. And now Joe never saw any of that, but he was convinced that was true. And that, you find, was quite common among the veterans. Some story about some anti-American story. It's interesting because they mostly had great stories about the Germans and the Italians. But there are no positive Japanese stories. People they don't like them. But there's a fellow called Ernest told me a story about the Germans when he carried a wounded German with his foot blown off, and the other Germans could see that he was doing it, and they all stopped shooting because he was carrying this fellow to his own regimental aid post. But the Germans spotted that and didn't shoot him. And he said when he came out of the regimental aid post, he had to go another 300 yards across open ground to get actually back into his own hole. And he said they didn't shoot then either. They saw who it was. That was his idea anyway. The stories like that are legion. That's the enemy. But you don't get many Australian soldiers saying nice things about American soldiers.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things is, of course, that a view of a country's soldiers isn't fixed in time. It evolves, it changes as the decades pass. And we had a couple of bits of pushback in the sidebar from people saying about the bush soldier being a bit of a myth. David Watson says, "I'm a proud Aussie, but the bush soldier is a myth." Is it because now we're in an area? Sorry,
I'm saying 50% of the AIF were from the bush.
But is that more of an idea? Because maybe Australia is more urbanized now, because we're 2025 now. Your cities have got bigger, and so maybe is there now an idea among younger Australians to kind of reclaim the city-born Aussie to counter the bush Aussie or the bush digger?
Oh, I think Australians are still believing this myth about the digger from the bush who can shoot and ride. I think it's still popular. If I'm answering your question, it's still popular.
Okay. No, you are. Yeah. No. So,
yeah.
Let's move on.
There's some fact in it. In 1939, in that war, that the Bush boys are joining in larger numbers. The AIF and the CMF, altogether, it's about 1/3 conscript and 2/3 volunteer.
Right.
So I'm not talking about the conscripts. I'm saying that the volunteers tended to volunteer a lot more from the bush. And as the country's only about 50% urbanised, everyone else is living in a small country town or on a farm or something like that, then you're going to have around about a half of them are bush soldiers. Something like Bob Iscoff that I read out to you. He shoots, fishes, and hunts, and he's a tough guy, and he's been like that since he was a kid. He worked on his dad's farm. So there is something in it.
We're going to talk a little bit about how a nation integrates and operates its different types of soldiers, from the regulars to the reservists to the conscripts. And we've talked about that with, for example, the American historian Stephen Clay, about the American First Division, for example, despite the movie cliche of the veteran soldiers not wanting to get to know the new guys because they would get killed. He said actually it was very, very good at integrating its people. So, when you've got an Australian unit, and some of your units, the 9th and things, who went through multiple campaigns in multiple theatres, as the war goes on, if you've got a reputation for toughness and resourcefulness and togetherness, do you think the Australian Army was good at incorporating, as the war went on, the more conscripted soldier, and maybe less of the bush people, more of the city people?
I don't know. The first thing that occurs to me to say is that there remains a divide between the CMF and the AIF. If that's touching on what you're talking about? They don't like each other. The AIF have got the prestige as the volunteers, but there's a lot of people in the CMF who are quite happy with the idea that they don't have to fight outside of Australia. In 1943, the government offered a scheme whereby CMF militia battalions of infantry could vote to become officially AIF, and about two-thirds of them did. About half of them did. So then they can say, I'm AIF. They get their prestige, but what it actually means in practice is they have to go and fight. They may be called upon to fight outside of Australia and the territories in New Guinea. But the AIF called the CMF called them koalas. They're not to be exported outside the country or shot at. Or chocolate soldiers. If they went up north, they'd melt in the sun. So that's. But in terms of incorporating individuals, I don't have any particular thing. I can remember people telling me. It's more like people telling me about individuals who didn't fit in, and I thought, the platoon can't go into action with this guy. We've got to get rid of him. We've got to tell the boss he's out. Because you can't trust. There's a nice little line, I won't bother trying to find it now, where he says mateship is, in its purest form, is in battle, and mateship is about trusting everybody. If you can't trust everybody in your little unit, then the thing doesn't work well. So if you've got somebody you don't trust, you try and get rid of them if you possibly can.
I'm glad you mentioned the mateship, because that's one of the things that I would fall on if there is a difference between the Australian soldier and the British and American. Is mateship really is an Australian word, and there's that famous quote after the Kokoda battle where the commanding officer refers to mateship as an Australian. You kind of half defined it there, but is that something you think is a uniquely Australian outlook?
Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's loyalty to your mates, not letting them down, especially in their hour of need. It's between men. It's that kind of bond between men, that friendship between men. That's what it is. I don't think that we can claim that something like that is unique to Australians. Can we?
But maybe the word, though, the word mateship.
The word is the word.
Out. Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, tell me about Englishmen.
Well, I mean, I think we would use mate. We call each other horrible names when we like each other, which is really weird. But I wanna drill down on media representations, because I actually rewatched The Fighting Rats of Tobruk a few weeks ago, and I watched 40,000 Horsemen, and obviously they're 80 years old now, so they're a bit clunky, and the battle scenes. But that would have been something that not only the Australian public were getting, the world public were getting about the Aussie soldier. Do you think they are good representations, too cliched? Is there some truth there? I mean, some people watching this won't be familiar with these films.
There's some truth there. Yeah. There were the Light Horse of the First World War. That's set in 1916. The 40,000. The Light Horseman or 40,000.
Either. Yeah.
Oh, Light Horseman. Yeah, I think they were quite like that. I think that's a good representation of the kind of they're boys from the bush. They can all ride. They're supposed to be able to ride before they can sign on. So I think that's a good representation of what they were like. And I'm sad that they're not around anymore.
Mm.
You know, I really like those guys. I like them. I told you I was frightened of them. I was thinking mainly about when I got my first job, and I'm 18, 19, 20, and all of my bosses were war veterans, and I was frightened of them then. When I was little, you know, I'd just go up and talk to any old bloke and say, "Tell me about the war." So 40,000 horsemen and the light horsemen, yes, I think there's something in them as representations of what Australian soldiers are like.
Ernest Malley said, "Slander. Chips Rafferty never ages." He says there. I mean, Chips Rafferty. He's kind of the equivalent of Australia and America, where they have William Bendix, who's in all the Marine movies in the 40s and 50s, and perhaps Britain had, I don't know, John Mills or someone like that who represented.
Yeah, well, Chips Rafferty was a veteran. Well, a veteran of the Second World War. He was in the Royal Australian Air Force in the Second World War. I think they pulled him and let him make movies. In fact, wasn't the 40,000 Horsemen, wasn't that made, wasn't it the sand dunes near Sydney in about 1940, was it? And, you know, that makes it a World War II propaganda movie.
A World War II movie set in the First World War, yeah.
Set World War One, but obviously there to inspire.
And I'm thinking again that even those Australian movies, they tend to highlight the digger, the enlisted man, the guys at the bottom, whereas maybe the British movies focused on the officer class. You know, I'm thinking of Reach for the Sky with Kenneth Moore as you know, as Douglas Bader, and John Mills always playing naval officers and things like that. I can't think of a war movie. Someone will think of one where there's Australian officers are the heroes. It's in fact, the Australian officers are often the villains, but particularly in Mel Gibson's Gallipoli film, and the British officers, they are the baddies.
It might be something. I can't think of a case, but that might be a point of difference, perhaps, between the British soldier and the Australian soldier, or the Australian soldier and the Canadian soldier. I'm not sure. This relationship with officers. It seems to have been a very good relationship. The soldier with his platoon commander was often a very good relationship. There was not, I think, that distance that you perhaps sometimes found in the British Army in the Second World War. I can recall a story I was told, which I think sort of illustrates this. There was a fellow in this platoon told me the story. Their platoon commander was Bob. I don't remember what his name was. They had, this is in North Africa, and they had been in several battles before, and Bob knew the men knew Bob, and it was a good relationship. And they had made several assaults with Bob's leadership. And one day they're out and they're hiding in some rocks, and two German armoured cars show up nearby, not right close, but nearby. And Bob says to the boys, "Let's have a go at them. Let's get them." And it's dark, and out of the night, up a couple of men up from the fellow who told me the story, comes this voice. "Not this time, Bob." And he's just telling the officer, "Look, we're not committing suicide. This is not a smart one." And indeed, the armoured cars then wandered off. And they talked about it later, and Bob was okay with it. He gave his men something, that they'd made a good decision here, and perhaps he had got a bit carried away. But I just liked that line. "Not this time, Bob."
And do you think? I mean, Banana Brooks just said less class differences. I mean, we've talked with yourself, with Phil Bradley, about all the inventions that are coming out of New Guinea, building airstrips out of bulldozers dropped by aircraft, the development of, even maybe tank infantry cooperation, artillery infantry cooperation. The Anzac troops seem to be maybe better at that. Even in Normandy, 5 years into the war, there's this thing between the British cavalry regiments and the British infantry regiments, upper class, working class. It seems to be a bit disharmonious. That doesn't seem to be an issue for the Australians.
No, well, maybe I don't know. Maybe they had those things better organised. But there's something that just occurred to me. If I might head off in a different direction, you mentioned artillery. One thing that was surprised to discover, talking to these hundreds of veterans, is that the fellows who'd been in North Africa, when they were told to come back to Australia, a lot of them were disappointed because they thought they were going to the small war. This was the big war. This was the thing they were supposed to be in. You know, Greece, Crete, Syria, North Africa, possibly go to Italy and Sicily. This is part of the big war. But now we're going back to pokey little islands in the Pacific. Now, there's the other side of this story is, of course, people saying, well, the Japanese might invade Australia. We've got to get back and defend it. Yes, that's true. But also there was this idea, especially among officers who may have wanted to continue on in the army after the war, who wanted more experience of the big war, what they called the big war. There was an artillery officer who told me that at Bardia and Tobruk in 41, he's commanding 70 or so guns and doing all the work to organise a bombardment for 70 guns. And he said, a year later in New Guinea, I'm obsessing about getting one 25-pounder and 200 rounds of artillery up this muddy track onto this hill so I can shoot at the Japanese over there. Because in the jungle, generally, you're just not so much use for artillery. But he used it as an example of how he'd gone from the big war to a backwater, a sort of a disappointing war. But it's a thing that never occurred to me before, but several people mentioned it. Actually, a naval officer told me that he served with the Royal Navy up to and including Normandy, and then he was sent back to Australia. And he said he found the Royal Australian Navy was not up to the standard of the Royal Navy. He felt he'd sort of come to the second team, and he was quite disappointed in that last year of the war. Anyway, I'd never heard those things before, and that's what some of the veterans told me. Sorry, just went off.
No, it's good. But talking about the last year of the war, when we've talked about on this channel about Borneo and other campaigns like that, where often the Australians refer to in that horribly derogatory way of mopping up where the main battles go. You know, how did the Australian public, how did the Australian soldiers that you spoke to deal with the fact that they are to some extent relegated to the bridesmaid role as the last year of the war, compared to the Americans are doing the proper, and I'm putting it from their point, in the liberation of the Philippines, they're carrying on the island hopping. The Australians are relegated to a minor role. I mean, it's happening to the British in the ETO as well. But what was the men you spoke to? What did they think about in that last year of the war?
Well, they were told that they were that these natives on these islands were many of them the King's subjects too. King George VI's subjects, like the British Solomon Islands Protectorate, which was then Bougainville was part of it. So fighting on Bougainville, the alternative argument was, do we leave these people to suffer under the Japanese for another 5 years or however long the war takes, or are we obliged to come and rescue them? And there's something in that argument. I'm not sure how convinced they were by that, but they understood that argument anyway, that you couldn't just sit around and do nothing about it. Okay. No, go on. Sorry.
I was going to say, so to kind of begin to round things up, you know, we're now 80 years since the end of the Second World War. There have been movies, there have been TV series about the Australian soldier in various wars. Where do you think the reputation of the Australian sits now? Is it different to perhaps when you started studying history? Both internally and from other countries.
Yeah. I think the reputation's still good. After World War II, the Australian soldiers regarded as a top-notch jungle fighter.
Yeah,
and he's learned a lot about fighting in the jungle, and that carries on into Vietnam. Certainly, the Australians are regarded as knowing something about this, and some of the older men, some of the officers in Vietnam have served in World War II, fought in the jungles. There's definitely something there that this reputation that I don't know. But now the jungle fighting reputation, I think, is forgotten.
I I mean, even when they film modern war movies, that things like the Pacific, they film some of it, you know, on the Gold Coast in Australia, because you do have jungles there. Whereas if you're coming from Sheffield in the United Kingdom, there's not much chance of jungle training until you go into theatre. So,
no,
I mean, even going back to
Far North Queensland looks a lot like New Guinea. And it was used as the training ground. The Atherton Tablelands were used as the training ground in from 43 through 45 because it's like New Guinea. You walk around in the jungle there and you think, yep, I could be in New Guinea here.
But you said the key word there, you said from 1943. I mean, it's fair to say if we go back to the earliest experiences of Australia in World War II, like the Brits, like the Canadians, they're learning on the job. The idea of doing you know, proper in location training is a sort of a mid-war and onwards thing. The Australian soldier, when he first turned up in Papua, like is a fish out of water, like the British in Malaya.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. And they were convinced that the enemy were sort of expert jungle fighters, but they weren't. But both sides were convinced of that, actually, just because it's hard to see people in the jungle. Neither side had specific jungle training. But of course, naturally, it's an oppressive sort of environment. It's like jungle fighting is like night fighting. And the Australian Army didn't train for that either. The Western armies in general didn't train for night fighting. At night, you stayed in your hole. It was the Japanese who trained to fight at night. So you get this oppressive effect in the daytime as well, because often you can only see 20 yards. And so it's like nighttime, and people just felt out of their depth. Yeah, it's true.
I mean, there was a question earlier, which I didn't bookmark, particularly about New Guinea and night fighting, because John McManus, in his book about the US Army in the Pacific, talks about in New Guinea there being a difference at what time of day to engage the enemy, and when the Americans start getting better at things, the Australian doesn't fight at night, as you were just saying. There was also the Americans are starting to develop, you know, not so much night vision stuff, but the ability to do things at night, and that causes some disagreements between the forces. Is that something you've looked at?
No, I didn't come across that. I was unaware the Americans did much at night. I thought they followed our policy, which was it was not something we trained for, so it's not something we tried to do in the middle of the war. But it was something the Japanese trained for. So they were more skilled at it. No, we didn't.
Well, that's the ongoing cliches. When I talked about the comics, yes, I definitely remember reading the Australians were better than the British, but the comics, the Japanese were the masters. That was the Japanese were the masters of the jungle fighting, and I think we're still of the opinion that the Japanese somehow were born with this mastery of jungle fighting that the Allies didn't have. And I don't quite know where that came from, other than the fact they had the upper hand.
Well, my theory is that because I've interviewed both sides, I've interviewed 100 Japanese veterans too, and they both said, well, say the Australians, I heard that as a kid, the Japanese masters of jungle warfare. Then you go and interview the Japanese and they say, those Australians, masters of jungle. It's the bloody jungle. You can't see anybody in it. It's really easy to hide in the jungle, and you become convinced, these guys are clever. We can't see them. And I would ask Australian soldiers questions about how many Japanese did you see in the war, live Japanese? And people would say, oh, none. No live ones. I just fired at where the corporal told me to fire at. And, you know, sometimes you'd wander over and there might be a body there, and you might have been the one that shot him, but you don't know. But the point is, plenty of people never saw a live Japanese. And I'm sure the Japanese would say the same thing.
Well, that's I think a universal truth, isn't it? I mean, there were studies done about all theaters about how many men are actually firing at targets and how many men are just firing broadly down the range in the direction of the enemies. And again, it's the movies where every engagement is in the courtyard of a farm in Normandy, or it's over a stone wall in Tobruk with bayonets fixed. And although that happened, it doesn't happen anything much as commonly as just firing into smoke, essentially. So
another thing I could mention, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but I mentioned before how the Australians had the veterans always had a good word to say about the Germans or the Italians, even the Vichy French, even them.
Right. But please do. Yeah, expand.
But no one would say tell a good story about the Japanese. I mean, there's a fellow here, Des Moran. He sums up what around about half the veterans thought till their dying day about the Japanese. I don't know if you want me to.
Yeah, please do.
Find it. Here it is. Where is it? Yeah. Might have a bit of swearing in it. Can I swear?
You can swear, but don't use the full word for Japanese, not the short version, because that can get us blocked.
Use the full word.
Use if the 3-letter word, the short for Japanese comes in. Use the full word.
Okay. All right. Might be tricky. In the kuno grass at Buna, I found a Japanese flat on his back with dysentery. He was covered in flies and shit, and the muddy water in which we all lived there. He had no pants on. He was just crapping himself. I pointed the Thompson at him, and I thought, well, mate, you're going to die. Why waste one slug? So I turned around and walked away. Ernie said later, did you shoot the bastard? I said, no. I hope he suffers like I am. I'm afraid I retain a hell of a hate for the Japanese. They started the bloody thing. They gave us the biggest tragedy and drama of our lives. So why should you be kind to the bees? They were going to take this country, and we had family back here. And when we came back from the Middle East, we heard they were eating our blokes. We saw what was left of it at a foggy. It was one of the most hideous sights you'd ever see. Skeletons propped up against trees. This is Australian soldiers that had been eaten. Been there for weeks. Marsupials and insects eating them. Bits of skin laying around a foot here and there. We knew we had a bastard for an enemy. We had no wish to let the bastard survive. The only occasion we took prisoners was when command said they wanted a couple of Japanese to question. Otherwise, you dispensed with the bees. I've got no time for the Japanese. The amount of hate you build up in your system, it never goes out of you. Now, that's about a half of the diggers who fought in New Guinea. Till the day they died, that was their position. Others did say, you've got to let go of the war. I've been to Japan. I liked them. I had a nice time. I flew Japanese Airlines. I think they're nice people. So there's two threads there. Some people, Des just, you can hear what Des' opinion was.
Well, that's back to this idea that people said there is no such thing as a typical digger, not during the war, and how they dealt with the war. The same with the British. So, some joined veterans associations and went on these reconciliation trips. Others just, in a sense, kept hatred inside their souls till the rest of their lives. There's no right way to deal with it, or I would argue that's the wrong way of dealing with it. It's whatever works for you, I suppose. But when as I said at the beginning, we're going to be doing a series about the Canuck, the Tommy, the American soldier. Where this idea of the digger. When you travel the world as a historian and you go to places or people contact you, is there a perception of the Australian historian as being a little bit connected to the Australian digger? Are you seen differently as an Australian historian, perhaps compared to a British historian or an American historian?
I don't know. I've never asked anybody. I don't know. I don't know. No.
I mean, my perception in dealing with Australians.
What's your perception? What about you?
If I were to draw I would say that you're focused on the bottom end, the grittiness. There's a focus among Australians on that. What was it like at the front line, at the bayonet point?
Yeah. It's true. That's been my interest. Yes.
And I think sometimes American and British maybe look at it from a more operational point of view. What were corps doing, what were armies, and lots more of those discussions about broad front, narrow front, policies, whereas the Australian seems to be, the ones I know, it seems to be, we don't not care about that. What we care about is this company fighting on Shaggy Ridge, or this company in Tobruk, this company or this squadron fighting out of Port Moresby or Moreton Bay, whatever it would be.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I might have that fault too. Yes.
It's interesting. I mean, this is the thing about cliches, is that they exist because there's an element of truth, even if they are cliches. It's really, as David said, that sort of squad level of interest, which brings us back to the comics there. So I'm just checking any more questions there. We've talked about the portrayal over time. We've talked about the differences between the regulars, things like that. We talked about the foreign perception. Any kind of last remarks you want to make about, because this video is being watched by people in the UK and India and the Philippines and Oz, about the Australian soldier you'd like to get across?
I'd like to get across that he's a real mix, and there are some that fit like slab. He's commando comic material. He was, as everybody said, and he said it himself, he was a great hero. He was a great soldier, and he really enjoyed it. He found he was good at it. But the others, a lot of others didn't like it. Lindsay Mason, I mentioned, he had 4 days, and then he thought, "Oh, that'll do me. I think I'll find a cushy job." They are all of those things that I'm sure you can find in other armies. The lack of respect for authority is certainly a trait that runs through them. They're independent-minded. This is a trait that runs through them, but nor are they all like that.
No, I think there's some fair points there, and and Ernest May agrees. Yes, Australian history is unit focused, mirrors the style of the war to some degree. Excellent points. We had a quick question, a random one from Baskerville. Please ask Peter, the author of the Napoleon book you have in the background there behind you.
Philip Dwyer.
Philip Dwyer. There we are, an easy one to answer. And I think this has been a really good introduction to this series, because I think it's reinforcing ideas I had, and it's also challenging them as well, which is any good discussion has those two elements.
Yeah,
there.
I was hoping you'd done a couple of others so I could see what other people said about.
Well, yeah, someone has to be first.
Yeah,
we could do a Mark II though, Peter. We could do a second one.
I do want to see what people think is the difference between a British soldier and an Australian soldier, or a Canadian soldier, just sticking with, or New Zealander thinking of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued. Peter Hart is busy on trips to Gallipoli right now, but I'm interested in Peter Hart's opinion, because he's written about both British and Australians in Gallipoli and what have you. And his latest book is about Sudan and Khartoum and all that as well. So I think he's got to have some interesting insight into British soldier, but he also has an affection for the Australian or the Anzac soldier more broadly. So, well, we will end things now. Folks, I'm back in 9 hours' time with Tim Cook from Canada talking about the trial of Kurt Meyer. One of the notorious war criminals of the Normandy campaign. I'm looking forward to that one, despite the grimness of the topic. And we'll do a part 2. We'll do a Peter's right to reply when we've finished the series. You can come back and do a part 2. But in the meantime, everybody, thanks everybody for your questions. Please consider becoming a channel member or patron. Buy my guest books. The links to Peter's website is in the description below. But I will see you all in a few hours' time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
See you, Woody.